What's up, guys and gals of the movement world? It's Sean Mishka, the Movement Miyagi, coming to you once again on behalf of Football Beyond the Stats in our Mover of the Year feature. This year for 2023, our Mover of the Year, Christian McCaffrey, running back from the San Francisco 49ers. And in this video, I want to just get into a little presentation, diving into the ins and outs of how I would approach the craft of Christian McCaffrey if he and I were to ever partner together, with me as his movement and skill acquisition specialist or coach, working alongside of him and identifying both the gaps as well as the opportunities that I feel still exist, even though he is the most dexterous mover in the National Football League today. I really have a lot of fun putting this together, but I do want to offer the disclaimer. This is from my form of life. This is how I see the world and how I attempt to attack the athlete's skill development, their skill enhancement, and ultimately their skill adaptation based on all of the film that I watch and what I identify as these major opportunities or gaps that a player could still attempt to fill. Because no matter how dexterous a player might become, there are still some unsolvable problems that they might face. It's intuitively obvious, right? Movement behavior in sport is a complex activity filled with complex adaptive systems interacting with a really complex world in this mutual reciprocal way between performer and environment, or between problems and solver coming together to be one with. And that is how I would chase it from my form of life right off the bat. So I kind of offer that global umbrella for y'all, just as you kind of set the tone for where it is that we're about to go. Now, with that, and at the crux of that, you guys have heard me say it before from my man Nikolai Bernstein, 1996, even though this was long, long prior to 96 when he said this idea of chasing the expression of dexterity. Essentially, guys and gals, if this is the first time you're hearing this, dexterity is just the highest expression of one's movement skill, the ability to coordinate, control, and organize, or as Bernstein would say, find a movement solution for any emerging movement problem under any situation and within any condition. And this becomes our North Star. It is our litmus test. It is what we chase in not only the assessment of players and how we've already identified Christian McCaffrey as our 2023 Mover of the Year, the most dexterous mover, but we want to look at chasing movement skill by setting movement problems for the player to solve, presenting emerging movement problems, letting those problems come to the player so they can interact with the what is, or what we would refer to as the what is. And with that, to continually change both situations and conditions. Because no matter how dexterous a player is, they can never become too dexterous, and they can always become more dexterous. But with that, I do want to remind y'all, and I remind you every single year with these Mover of the Year features when I put together the If We Ever Partnered Together video, that dexterity, as Bernstein would say, is not confined within the movements or the movement actions themselves, but instead it is only going to be revealed in how these movements will behave in their interaction with that becoming one with process, to become one with the movement problem, to become one with the environment as the player performer, with all its unexpectedness, all its surprises, all its aliveness. And as we see in the pictures here, when complex movement problems are amidst everywhere within a competitive performance environment on a football field, how do those players attempt to organize a functional reciprocal relationship? They become connected to that environment, inseparable from it. And this is what my perspective is with my movement skill form of life. And as a movement and skill acquisition specialist, what I attempt to chase more of for the player. And of course, I love unpacking and investigating movement behavior in this complex way with these relations, these connections, and these systems interacting with one another. And that, to me, is what we must also chase if we're going to ever attempt to express dexterity. Now, the great thing about Christian McCaffrey, and I've heard him talk about the influence of Bruce Lee on his craft before, which is really unique and really cool to me, of course, as a Bruce Lee fan myself and someone who's dove deep into the work of Bruce Lee. We must remember, as part of this movement problem solver paradigm, that an athlete's form of life in their movement and their skill execution is really about honestly and authentically expressing oneself. And the one cool thing about Christian McCaffrey, well, there's a lot of cool things about him and his movement skill, but one of the things that drives his form of life, very similar to previous mover of the years that we've had in the past, guys like Travis Kelsey last year or Jonathan Taylor the year before, or maybe going back to Lamar Jackson or all the way back to our first mover of the year in LaShawn Shady McCoy. This honest and authentic expression of one's movement and skill really comes down to the abundance within one's movement skill or within one's movement system that begins to set the tone for their authenticity and adaptability. That, as Bruce Lee would say, to use no way is the way, and to use no limitation as one's limitation. And finally, as the slide shows or the meme shows with the quote, that the man, the living creature, the athlete, the player, is the creating individual. And that creating individual who is honestly and authentically expressing themselves becomes more important than any established style or system, or in the case of Christian McCaffrey, any technical model that may have emerged from one's training. And again, we kind of dive into what his form of life entails, what this particular athlete's form of life entails. And we see a picture from the very top left there from Valor Christian High School when he was a track athlete, a multi sport athlete, playing both football as well as running track, and then playing basketball the way it sounds in the winter as well. And we see some of that reflected in how he behaves, how he acts, and how he sees the world. We also see him trying to perfect his craft. And that really has been established from the start. Now, for those of you who don't know, and if you haven't dove deep enough into our Mover of the Year feature, Christian comes from a family that is very serious about athletics. And in that seriousness and that dedication to one's craft comes a very perfectionist nature. And it's why he has attempted to perfect his movement in the way that we might see indicative of him going through the cone drill in these slalom cones or whatever it might be, or him trying to have this relentless work ethic that is applied in this pursuit of him trying to be the very best that he possibly can be. And that can and should be commended. I believe it should also be harnessed. And now don't get it twisted. I believe that the trainers that he worked with up to this point, some of which I know, and some of whom I know very, very well, and I consider friends of mine, they have harnessed this perfectionist nature. But I do wonder if there are some things that we could harness even more about Christian McCaffrey's unique form of life, his honest, authentic, creative self. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that. Like I mentioned, I want to give a few shout outs to previous trainers that he's had. First off, my man Lauren Landau, who's now at the University of Notre Dame as the director of sports performance. For the past number of years, he has been with the Denver Broncos as a head strength and conditioning coach or head of athletic development. And then obviously running his own place when he met Christian and trained and worked alongside of Christian, in particular in preparation for the NFL football combine. But when Lauren went to Denver, Christian went to Brian Kula, who also just so happened to be his track and field coach. Now, I don't know Brian, but there is quite a bit of uh, kind of detailed observations about what they've done within Christian's training that Christian would lean on in many cases, that he obviously takes great pride in and fully believes in, both the work that he had done with Lauren as well as in the work that he now does with Brian Kula. So shout out to those individuals. I'm not trying to take anything away from them in anything I'm about to offer from my unique form of life. In fact, obviously, I've never worked with Christian McCaffrey, and these guys have, and they have channeled his movement skill or helped channel his movement skill to allow him to facilitate this type of expression of movement skill that we have witnessed within our Mover of the Year feature. And then finally, we see that bottom picture. And granted, this is a picture from him in college, kind of on his grind. Christian's always been about that grind. He's always harnessed this relentless work ethic to be a guy who obviously is a white running back playing in today's National Football League and doing it at the highest of levels, to be used in very versatile and dynamic and athletic ways. He's always relied upon this type of mentality. And now, shout out to the San Francisco 49ers staff. My friend Dustin Perry, who's the head of performance or head of strength and conditioning there, along with his staff, obviously has allowed Christian, alongside of guys like Brian and guys like Lauren, and anyone else that Christian may have worked with up to this point, that have led and influenced Christian to this point or degree where he's on a field, healthy, performing in the most dynamic and versatile of ways, doing so week in and week out, and solving movement problems that most of the other 1,695 players across the league could only ever dream of solving. So shout out to each one of these individuals. And I think when we really look at his form of life and we say, maybe look at this quote from Christian, where he talks about his multi sport background, that which what has led to how he sees the world, in particular, how he attempts to interact with the problems of the world, we truly do see that multi-sport background. We see how versatile he is as a mover, and that versatility is fed from his abundance, and that abundance precedes his adaptability. And if there were one word that we were going to utilize to describe Christian McCaffrey, it probably would be adaptability. His adaptability is the calling card, it's the quality, it's the characteristic that underpins his dexterity or his ability to solve any emerging movement problem. He's always in this state of adaptability. And as I would say, to have adaptability within adaptability, kind of a play on Bernstein's words of repetition without repetition, right? But this adaptability becomes this springboard for dexterity. But it's all fed and led from his abundance. And I think that abundance is something that should be harnessed, but it's also something that we witness. We witness it over and over and over again with his current form of life. When he steps out on a football field and a movement problem is presented to him, this abundance shines through. To use no way as the way, to use no limitation as the limitation. We see it illustrated. We see it expressed. We see it demonstrated and exhibited every time he solves a movement problem, sort of as we see on the bottom of the screen there, as he's able to contort and change his body postures and positions to match and meet the needs of the unfolding problem. That no matter what that problem brings or offers him, this is why he's able to solve such a wide range of movement problems, probably going back to his form of life. But that really, to me, leads to opportunity number one. And I will admit, this is a slide that I also used with Travis Kelce last year. I believe, and now shout out to Christian and shout out to Brian Kula because I know that they do some of this type of work, opening up degrees of freedom. I think they probably do it to try and open up biomechanical or motor action degrees of freedom. And that's cool because we can't separate the actions from perceptions and we can't separate the perceptions from one's intentions, right? Remembering that they are all intertwined, they are all interwoven, they are all integrated perceptions, intentions, and actions. And so for me, I believe that Christians should harness this type of work even more, opening up those degrees of freedom to have more abundance. Now, he already has a very abundant movement toolbox. But again, like having too much money or too fast a car or too hot a girlfriend, these things just can't happen, right? And neither can having too much abundance or too many ways to solve a movement problem, especially when we're going to be presented with a plethora of movement problems, wide range. No two problems are ever the same, so neither are any two solutions. But if we're going to be presented with a wide range of movement problems, we want to be able to draw upon all kinds of experiences, all kinds of exposures. Christian has already begun to do that way back from back in the day with his multi sport background. But we see it right now if we watch features on YouTube of him training with Brian Kula and the like. He's doing gymnastic work. He's doing some of the animal flow work that we might see here from Ido Portal and Erwin LaCour and my friend Rafe Kelly from Evolve Move Play. I think if Christian, just like I suggested last year with Travis Kelsey, were to even do more of this type of work, he would become even more sensitive and more intentional and ultimately more adaptable because he would have more abundance perceptually, what he's looking at, when he's looking at, how he's looking at it, what he might be feeling, cognitions and intentions, being able to change tempos, paces, speeds, base of support and center of gravity, contorting his body in novel, creative ways. You kind of see where I'm going with this. And so, this opening up of the degrees of freedom across the human movement system, not just motor actions, but to emphasize interacting with a wide range of environments, would make him even that much more, or have or possess that much more abundance. And that would begin to set the tone for him existing in the alive movement problems that I think need to be more of a primary forefront in his own training and practice environment in the offseason. Now, granted, once he gets to the San Francisco 49ers, once he gets to the team, it's likely that he's going to be immersed in these slices or snippets of the game that are highly alive. And of course, it could be argued that no player finds as much aliveness on the actual competitive game day environment as Christian McCaffrey, number 23 of the San Francisco 49ers. He's used all over the formation in all different ways, particularly when Kyle Shanahan starts puppeteering on some things and allows him to really show and shine out, right? So this aliveness in his connection to this alive environment, these problems that would have opponents almost always present. But yet we don't see that when we look at his training. We often see isolated, decontextualized work, or what I would refer to as dead training environments. Now, granted, again, he obviously fully believes in that which what he's doing and how it is that he's doing it. And I commend him for that. He should connect to those individuals that their message resonates for him. But if he and I were to partner together, I would throw him in these mistake-filled learning environments and existing in that aliveness so he could even become more tightly coupled to the opportunities that are present there, the challenges and perturbations, to harness that abundance and adaptability even further. And I believe that if he were to do this, particularly within agility problems, it would allow him to explore even more options, We see that bottom picture there where he's making a move with the crossover cut and has that hand feeler, that stiff arm feeler out there in front of him. I believe that if he were to exist in more aliveness, with more layered movement problems, with changing opponents frequently, just as he would see out in a game day environment, like he can't have too much exposure to this constantly changing movement problem that would be in front of him. Again, we're kind of thinking repetition without repetition, both within the problem variability as well as feeding into the solution variability that naturally would occur there. Ultimately, as I've mentioned in the bottom two bullet points there on the left-hand side of the screen, is this would allow him to play chess instead of checkers. He would stop becoming so sensitive and attuned to the immediate local movement problem or the opponent right immediately in front of him, which he sometimes gets very fixated or focused on with a focal vision. He gets almost too connected to that person in front of him that he doesn't look either beyond and through or to the side of left or right of that opponent. And he does sometimes miss opportunities or misperceives affordances that are going to be existing wider and deeper and longer. And that's why this opportunity feeds into a few other ones. But I would attempt to, from an education of attention, nudging his perceptual degrees of freedom so he were to have more sensitivity or explore the search for and of different information sources and layers of that information, of those information sources. So it would begin to set the tone for the adaptability even much more. What do I mean by that? As J.J. Gibson in 1979 would tell us, we're looking for perceptual attunement across the landscape. It isn't just that which lies ahead right in front of oneself, no matter how threatening or challenging or perturbing that may be. Ultimately, skilled perception or perceptual attunement, meaning a sensitivity to the most specifying informational variables that exist based on that movement problem that we could pick up, we could detect and utilize to regulate our own movements. Those perceptions should get wider, finer, which he already sort of has, longer and deeper. So beyond, imagine here looking to, being able to attend to not only 54 in front of him, not only the emerging or closing gap between 54 and 91, but then also 38. To simultaneously juggle these various informational sources or variables in a way that would channel his intentions, meaning what aims to act or how he aims to act based on the information he's picking up. It's perpetually feeding into those intentions, those decisions he might make, the thoughts he might think, and he remains open and responsive to it. And then ultimately, his actions. Now, again, we've already commended him. I've already commended him for the abundance. And I don't mean just abundance of his motor actions. I mean his perceptions and his cognitions also. But then his adaptability of the actions in relation to the environment. But there are still times that we see these gaps, and these gaps lead to opportunities from my perspective. Now, again, a player can never get too attuned, just like they can never get too adaptable or responsive to the aliveness. And I believe that having movement problems that look, feel, act, and behave in highly variable ways, but ways that will still exist on a football field, where we would be changing situations rep to rep really frequently, or potentially conditions really frequently, would just even boost the dexterity of the player who I feel is already the most dexterous player in the league. So to increase the longer perception, that which what lies beyond. So he's able to perceive, select, and act upon what I would refer to as successive affordances. How he solves this one local movement problem, the immediate movement problem in front of him, is going to perpetually feed into the movement problem that exists beyond him, or he's able to deal with both informational variables at the same time. So that's kind of 2A. 2B, notice I have the same quote. That perception becomes wider. Now I only highlight the with portion because as we can see him awfully attuned to the player to his right here, right? We see him looking right to that and look at how his crossover action is going from right to left here. But he is going to move right into essentially this danger zone or this bubble of another player. And we do sometimes see him from that or see that from him, particularly in traffic navigation type of scenarios. Now, Christian McCaffrey is the most skilled and most skillful 1v1 movement problem solver in the entire league, bar none, no questions asked. So when he's 1v1 in a slicer snippet of the game with a defender, it doesn't matter if it's a linebacker, a defensive end, a corner, a safety, it really doesn't matter who it is. He has a plethora of movement strategies and solutions. He has that very fine perceptual attunement, but he does sometimes lack perceptual width, maybe through his periphery, being able to pick up information sources here, or darting the eyes in scanning from left to right to go from that immediate guy over to one that might exist to his periphery and then back to the initial information source. So this is a place in a space that I feel as though is an opportunity to educate his attention or to try to channel perceptual attunement even further. And again, I believe that there's a reason why this was 2B to the 2A that came before, and it all builds off of more immersion in alive movement problems. Cross situations allow him the opportunity to seek, search, explore these potential informational variables across the width and across the length or depth of the movement problems. And again, no two problems are ever the same, so neither any two solutions, but we want him to go through that process of solving a constantly changing problem over and over and over again. Now, the elephant in the room is Christian McCaffrey, especially with going way back to his days in Valor Christian, and even back further than that, watching his dad or having people chase him on a football field. This is part of his form of life. So it could be argued that maybe there's very few people or players who've been exposed to a wide variety of movement problems, as Christian McCaffrey has. But for me, he sometimes gets really comfortable, really connected from a perceptual degrees of freedom standpoint with being a little too constrained to immediate opponents and doesn't allow his perceptual degrees of freedom to be coordinated and controlled bigger and wider in relation to these constantly changing problems. And part of this, guys and gals, at least for me, leads to the third opportunity. We've talked before at and within our movement play, or mover of the year, feature here, our deep dive movement analysis videos that if you've watched them prior to this point, we talk on repeat about his technical model of acceleration. World class for football acceleration from 3 to 5 steps, 5 to 10 yards, as good as it comes, particularly at the running back position. And he's able to find that technical acceleration model off of just about any preliminary movement. Like he's able to hit acceleration mechanics that we would write home to mom about, right? So you can see where the training has paid off. But I believe that there is a real opportunity for him to become more attuned, meaning more sensitive to attending to the useful informational variables, tightly coupling his own movement actions, in this case acceleration, to the informational variables that need to be detected about opponents who are chasing and converging. Maybe chasing from behind, as we see with the Myles Garrett example, the big cat here who's chasing him that we did see him up against in the Browns play, or then the defensive back. Now, in this particular play, he is relatively sensitive and attuned, and we do see that from him. It leads to his intentionality. It leads to his openness, his responsiveness of adjusting these acceleration mechanics, as well as the tempo, the rhythm, the speed to match and meet the needs of the problem. Maybe the angle of his actual acceleration or running mechanics. We see him slightly change it in a curve, a linear fashion, or a little bit of dip and a little bit of dive to get away from chasing defenders. But there are times that it isn't overly tightly coupled, that he is so focused on getting into those acceleration mechanics and hitting those pretty shapes, showing us that posture, showing us those patterns and putting them on display, that he isn't overly sensitive to angles of pursuit at times, in the open field in particular, that could leave some room for growth, maybe some yardage to gain, maybe some touchdowns to score, even though he is the NFL's leading scorer and the leading rusher as well. Just because someone is the leading rusher and just because they are the leading scorer does not mean that there isn't still room for growth there. I believe that this is a place or a space to exist within, having all of his acceleration work, or at least much more of his acceleration work, not just being about hitting this technical model that we see, that has obviously been a big part of who he is and what he's done, from his time with Lauren to his time with Brian, and now even probably what he's doing with Dustin and the staff with the 49ers. Really focused in on resilience and robustness to injury because of trying to chase efficient and effective movement mechanics, particularly in acceleration or in linear sprinting. Cool. I commend y'all for it. But I would suggest or propose that more work actually needs to be done in relation to an opponent, more acceleration work, more top speed work, where he has guys moving at various angles in relation to where he's going. So he's able to always connect to them. We sometimes see him hit his mechanics, and obviously he had a ball in his hand, right? He hits those mechanics and he's right here by himself until all of a sudden it's too late and a guy has gotten in his path. We've even seen it in some of the feature plays. Now, because of his action capabilities, particularly because of his truly exceptional deceleration in context, like he has the ability to stop on a dime from very high speeds, right? This is one of the calling cards, one of the strengths of his movement skill. So he's able to still sometimes exploit these opportunities that exist there from those converging defenders. But I would propose finding and encouraging him to go search for that information earlier and require it in our learning and training environments. Require him to move in relation to not only one defender, but various defenders, numerous defenders, changing the defenders up really frequently, having them chase from different positions and from different angles over different distances, and maybe with differing problems or aliveness, complex problems to solve out in front of him. And I believe that this would lead to even more intentionality, more openness and responsiveness to interacting with the what is. Guys and gals, I tapped into 3 different opportunities, 3 of the aspects that I would hit on in particular that would be my points of emphasis or be my focus if I were to ever work with Christian McCaffrey, the player who I still recognize as the most dexterous, the most skillful mover in the entire league. Again, just because a player has already achieved the highest expression of skill and dexterity doesn't mean that there still is a room for improvement, an area for improvement. I would suggest that if Christian McCaffrey were to ever watch this, to even just ruminate about it, you can tell he's always thinking about being his very best self. And I would encourage him to find ways, even more ways, to become one with that emerging alive movement problem. And if he were to do that, we're talking about even greater transcending movement skill of the likes of Barry Sanders and some of our other movers of the year, who obviously Christian is already in that category with. Guys, if you have questions, thoughts, concerns, ideas, anything that you want to run by me, by all means, put it in the comments section below. If you want to drop me an email instead, there is my email address. It's Sean at emergentmovementmvmt.com. And if you like anything that we had shaking here, not only in this presentation, and you just even have questions or thoughts, or want to learn a little bit more about this respective form of life, that would be the place to check it out, along with obviously my blog at footballbeyondthestats.wordpress.com. No matter what, at the end of the day, Christian McCaffrey is the most skillful player in the National Football League today. I commend him in his training up to this point and getting him there and facilitating that type of movement skill that is very special to watch and that I love breaking down and getting within as I watch that which unfolds. So for Sean Mishka, the Movement Miyagi, this has been our Mover of the Year 2023 feature. What would I do if Christian McCaffrey and I partnered together?